LINAC quality control, that is to say linear accelerator quality control, from standards to patients. And on the picture you can see a beautiful image from fluorescence from glass of accelerated electrons in a very early tube, a low pressure gas-filled tube, and this was known to create that fluorescent image at the far end of the, away from the electron source, the gun that was thermionically emitting electrons way back in the early 19th century, I should say 20th century, sorry. And that is a picture of the tube de-energized, showing its construction and the shadow formed by the Maltese cross. And it is a Crookes tube. Early Röntgen experiments created that acceleration of electrons towards a positive plate. This picture is of a beautiful bumblebee sensing apparently the electrostatic field around flowers, and I was struck by this image recently, so I included it to, by the way of getting a kind of idea that electricity is key and around us. We can't always sense it, but indeed some of the insects can. And it's the electric force that provides the acceleration in that Crookes tube and also within our linear accelerators, although the energy range of the accelerator goes up to many millions of electron volts, which we can't produce in a tube, conventional Crookes tube. And one of the introduction overview slides includes this dramatic picture of Nicholas Tesla in the early 20th century, sitting in his electrostatic generator in the United States, where he emigrated to. He wasn't actually in that position during the exposure of the electricity. Actually, it was a time-lapse photograph, so he provided a dramatic illustration. But we want to think about what kind of risks and controls of those risks we in the profession and caring radiotherapy team give and control to our patients. There's many causes of these risks that enable the treatments to go ahead, and there's many mitigations. I've just listed a few, including legislation, standards, recommendation, and also learning from incidents during the practice of radiotherapy. And I name on the penultimate line there, towards safer radiotherapy. I'll refer to this as a publication in due course, but it is a key document that was put together in the 2008 by a radiotherapy team, and the developments of that document are key to our current and immediate future approach on QC and quality assurance in general. But to summarize what the physicists and the dosimetrists do, and what indeed we adjust as part of our LINAC QC, we adjust and calibrate the position of the radiotherapy and the amount of radiotherapy. And we call this the dosimetry. And it's key to having an optimized and therefore justifiable radiotherapy dose, which, as you're aware, goes to many thousands of times higher than a imaging, that is to say a diagnostic type dose of radiotherapy, radiation I should say. So some of the early procedures and documentations going back to 1985, the ICRP put out a seminal volume in its ICRP 44 that talked about accuracy of radiotherapy and protection of the patient thereby. And it even identified that well-trained staff, together with a good QA program, will reduce errors. And it introduced this notion of second checks, which of course has become standard practice. And we moved through some implementation of a more modern approach to radiotherapy called conformal radiotherapy, which involved a degree of sophistication in the shaping of the radiotherapy beams to conform to the tumour and thereby spare the organs at risk which surround any tumour from excessive radiotherapy dose, excessive and problematical. So in that way, the radiotherapy world has improved by improving the optimization. And as I mentioned, advanced safer radiotherapy is an evolution from towards safer radiotherapy, and that is under construction by the team at the UK Patient Safety Authority now. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was struck when I had a day off one day, and you and yours was on the radio, and she mentioned Fiona McRae, this condition that she'd been diagnosed with, breast cancer, and coming through that and some of the affiliated issues with her treatment, she was determined to go away for a holiday, and she found it hard to get holiday insurance. And she mentioned the approach that I'm going to talk about later in the talk, a cyberknife treatment, and how it is really effective at dealing with brain metastatic lesions. And I'll explain a little more about what those are. Fiona is still working in her company that she created, and she was determined to open the opportunity for people to live after their radiotherapy treatment in a more full way without any financial issues from that insurance cost. So I'm going to talk mostly on brain metastases, which is a particular I'm talking, so I'll come back in a bit. I don't want to see you. Thanks. So we are talking about diseases that arise from other primary diseases, and they are often in more healthy lungs or liver, or in particular the brain. And it's the brain therapy that I'm going to talk about that we performed some particular quality control on. And indeed, I'm referring here to the Royal College of Radiologists recommendations about different sizes and doses for treatment of these lesions, or brain mets as they're commonly known. And the idea of stereotactic radiosurgery, which is basically very precise and high dose treatment in a few fractions, daily treatments, and it gives a very effective outcome. And I'm putting a few graphs up that look quite similar, but they are different. This is about how many treatments we have given on our SRS services, and I want to draw attention to the line in red, cerebral metastases, which is the one I will be referring to more fully. So basically, we have had since 2016 and 17 a steady rise from 40 per year up to about 80 per year of METS patients, and we treat the majority of these with our cyberknife units, of which we have 2 in the Marsden. So the situation with regarding the source of how these diseases, these lesions arise from primary lung is the predominant source, and breast is the second most common, in the sense of the percentage of the patients who have METs from which a primary is identified. So mostly are lung patients, and basically the number of metastatic lesions, the most common is either 1 to 4, seen by the overlap of the red and the blue curves here. I'm just going to try and highlight this with my laser pointer, i.e. these curves. So more commonly than the 10 or more lesions in the brain, though we do treat some of those patients. So the key idea of the overall survival is displayed here in a graph, and the benefit, the improvement that I'm displaying here nowadays, this time axis is in months. Prior to high quality SRS treatment, this would have more likely been in weeks. So we still have some patients that are around and with us 90 months on. So 96 months is 8 years. So it's not at zero even there. So that is a very hopeful picture for many of our patients with these brain mets. And 50% of them have one extra year, as it were, of life to spend with their families. And I just thought I'd mention the number of patients we treat on our CyberKnife 1 and 2 units are roughly the same, and they are about 60 or so patients each per year. This is a picture of the CyberKnife at Fulham Road, and I've labelled it with some identifying labels. The patient lies on this couch here, and this is the robot looking like a giant Pixar lamp. And the LINAC itself, the linear accelerator tube, is about 30 centimeters long within this box, pointing directly down and out through the collimate box that pulses the gun with the requisite voltages, the electron gun. And part of the process for X-ray tubes, for IGRT is implemented with these X-ray tubes. There is in fact 2 of them. One is out of the picture on the other side, X-ray tube A and B, and that provides a stereotactic, which means to say in 3-dimensional space, a way of aiming the robot at the required place in the patient. And this somewhat eye-catching image represents the separate radiotherapy beamlets by hollow tubes, sort of aiming within the patient brain and showing the different entry orientations around the patient. There's many, there can be hundreds of beams. There's probably about 80 here of slightly different diameters. The minimum is 5 millimeters, and I think the maximum in this plan is probably 20 millimeters. But it's showing the range of entry angles and positions. That is a phantom plan. That is to say, it's not a real patient. And this is a key diagram about how the radiotherapy dose is calculated from these pencils of radiation that are overlapping in various parts. This was from an early paper on the mathematics of line drawings by George Birkhoff, and it was part of the inspiration in the series of papers and ideas that led to what was known as IMRT, intensity modulated radiotherapy. So you can get the idea that the overlapping lines here overlap and create high dose, that is to say high black areas, and minimum dose or whiter areas. So Steve Webb, who led the physics department here for many years, put out a paper in '99 about robotic LINAC, IMRT, and he referred to a '95 paper, including John Adler and Schweikart. John Adler was a neurosurgeon from California that came up with the kind of principles, and indeed one of the early implementations of this. And the '88 paper here refers to CyberKnife per se, so that they put that system together in the early 2000s, sorry, the late 90s. And this is a kind of slice through the CT scan of our phantom, and I chose it to represent what I'm going to show you in due course, the dosimetric results. But for those not familiar with CT, it represents a sectional view, and what wouldn't be in the patient is our detectors here, which are illustrated by these white areas and by the spheres on the top of these detectors, representationally rendered in the computer for us. And at this stage, I'm going to try and show you an image a moving image, which is in fact a simulation. Tell me if you can see this, guys. Can you see the media player, or will I share it? I will.
I can't see it moving, Rollo.
Okay. Can you see the media image window?
Not at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to share it. Window, screen or tab. Window, media player, share. Right.
That's it. I can see that now.
This is a simulation. Shows a linear accelerator preparing to deliver radiotherapy, and we get the rare view of being inside the room, and if you can just about see the yellow beamlets entering the image phantom head, you can see 3 of them, and that corresponds to the number of lesions that we had introduced into our phantom. This imagery was created by VIRT, the virtual radiotherapy simulator software, of which I'll tell you more later. But I just wanted to describe the arcing movement of the linac around the patient. This is not a cyberknife, it's a true beam linac, but the principles of the irradiation and the separate dosage due to the physical separation in space, or within the patient's brain, I should say, of the lesions is a key aspect of this treatment. And indeed, how precisely we can aim this radiotherapy is the key to the success and the high dose delivery ability. So the software has now made the patient disappear, and what we're looking at now is suspended in space is the brain met lesions themselves that we want to restrict the dose to. And in this style of radiotherapy, the CT scan is coming there to show the representation of where the radiation beam interacts with the lesion, and illustrating the way in which this software is useful in both tuition and for planning the radiotherapy from an oncological point of view. I'll show a little bit more, but that was the key idea that I wanted to introduce, the relationship between the geometry of the CT scan and, in this case, the linac rotating around the patient, because it's very similar to the way that the robot in the cyberknife moves around the patient. And there the patient has been switched off, as it were, and the lesions are there floating. I will attempt to move it on a little bit because there's some quite interesting angles of. Now, this part is showing a slightly different view. The part on the right is showing what's called a beam's eye view. So it's as if we're at the radiation source looking out, and you can see those planetoid lesions moving relative to each other as the linac gantry rotates around the patient. And the aperture that we're aiming the radiation through is the open blackish aperture between the green and the blue leaves. So as the machine rotates around, you can see the corresponding beams on the left-hand side overlapping with the lesion or not. I'll pause that now, stop sharing that and go back to the main chat. Now I may have to share again the slides. I will try this one. So that corresponds, that view that you've just seen corresponds to the beams overlapping with these 3 lesions. And what we in fact measure with our radiation detectors is the very small high dose purplish region within the cloud of radiotherapy on the radiotherapy dose distribution. So I'd probably readdress that we start thinking about our QC when a particular patient style or a new technique comes to be designed, and the way in which we record our dosage depends on both traceability, how we trace that information to primary standards, using the approaches in national procedures and, of course, the National Instrumentation Network via the NPL. And the most important aspect is the team approach, because communication and discussing the possible errors in advance, and of course the ones that we don't see, learning from those. So I'll go a little more deeply into the linear accelerator and the way the radiotherapy is generated. This is a kind of translucent view of the LINAC tube itself and the beam coming out through monitoring systems and the energy source at the right hand side. This is an actual LINAC accelerator cut in half. So the low energy end where the electrons are introduced is here. So they're injected with a 40 kV potential into the guide, and the guide is filled with radio frequency like radar RF, and they're accelerated by virtue of the standing wave induced of electricity in these cavities, which are very shiny. The whole thing is made of very pure copper, and they're accelerated up to about 6 mega electron volts, and they emanate. They come along, they're held in place by magnetic fields, and they come along, they hit this target and get converted into photons in this way here. Right, time check. Oh, it's already past. Mark, how long we got?
You're doing all right, Rollo. We didn't start till about 10 past, so I think we can go on for about another 10 minutes, if that's all right.
Yeah. So this is showing one aspect of the patient preparation, a fixation mask that's usually made in mold room or CT when the patient first arrives. And this is for our Phantom, the one in the previous picture, that is in fact a 3D printed plastic shell with anatomy in, and it's water filled. We call it RT ion for a reason I'll tell you later, but it's in a particular mask with some fixation and position detecting bobbles on the top. And what that enables us to do is take the CT scan and calculate the dose within the planning system, which is the predictive calculating model. We call it the TPS. And what I've done here is all those yellow lines are very complicated overlaps of where the radiotherapy beam is going to, in fact, intersect with the lesion on this screen from the different arcs for different couch rotations. And what I'm demonstrating more fully before we go into it is if I draw on the screen a diagonal line, an arrow, I can get the dose along that vector, and the dose along that vector is indicated in the purple, sorry, the red curve here, and the distance indicated on that particular index is given by these purple numbers, which are hardly visible. But that's key. I can export this profile of dose as a text file and use the data subsequently to compare with measurements. Now, what I'm showing you now is essentially where I have positioned a detector right at the peak of this curve, like here, within the patient, within the Phantom, I should say, and that corresponds to the point on the scan about here, i.e. directly inside one of those lesions. And I've done this experiment a number of times, hence the crosses and the circles, and I'm comparing the treatment planning predicted dose against the measurement dose that I've measured on an actual delivery. I get a linear curve, which is understandable, and we get a good correlation factor that only indicates about 1.5% of width of the confidence interval around that line. And this is in grey, as this is. So it's quite a high dose number, 25 within the high dose measurement point. Now I'm moving on. I'm referring now to the dose vector along that profile. And here I've got a number of points indicated by a dotted line, which is the calculated dosage, or some big crosses or different color, big green dots or blue dots. And the blue dots are measured with thermoluminescent dosimetry glass beads. that a company called True In Vivo produce in a line of dose. I'm going to skip this briefly, but it's basically a more detailed view on similar experiments, all showing good agreement. And the agreement that we reach with the dose points are within as the worst case of 5%, which is adequate for these high dose regions, and most of them are less than that. This is a picture of the TLD itself, and the scale of millimeters on the bottom. So each of these green spherelets is a TLD. They're about 1 millimeter size, and these gold bubbles are radio opaque markers, and this set of colored rainbow-like bubbles are coders, so they can be used to tell which detector is in which position in the phantom and read out along a string of beads which give us each of these blue circles overlaid on the calculated orange line from our CyberKnife planning system. So this was for one of our CyberKnives, and I haven't quantified the statistical uncertainty on this, but you can see that the majority of the measurements correspond with the majority of the dose calcs. We get some weirdness in this region, and that's partly to do with the way that the beams are bigger and overlap, and different edge effects lead to an uncertainty. So we would investigate the clinical consequences of this and move on to mitigate any risks accordingly. So this is our other CyberKnife with the corresponding pictures from the dose planning system. And again, we're seeing reasonable agreement. And I think that the disagreement that we see in this low dose region is essentially to do with a misalignment that we identified after the case between the detector rod and the plan. So basically, when we delivered it, we didn't use all of the 6 degrees of freedom correction. And when we repeat this, I'm expecting to get better results. That was for the third and very small dose region. Now, this is quite an interesting pair of images. These are now live X-ray images, and you can see the contrast for the radio opaque markers in the True In Vivo detector in this shot here, and also some of the ion chambers that we used for the point doses, which I mentioned, getting better than 5%. I've included this work, which we did a few years prior, which involves a very fascinating technique using MRI readout of a radio-sensitive gel. So when the gel is irradiated, more crosslinks form in the gel, and the T2 readout time changes. So you can actually quantify this. It's quite linear, that with radiotherapy dose, the T2 time changes, and you can read it out in a similar scan to a patient-like scan. And indeed, you can see this is a coronal view where the nose is here and the surrogate brain is here, because the whole brain cavity is filled with this radio-sensitive gel. And this might be at the level of one of the eyes, for example, which could be here. And all this work is for the same arrangement of brain met distribution. So I just put that up to remind me that Shakar Jafari runs the company, and it's a very innovative and useful company, and it's a modest cost. So the gel system is probably of the order of 5 to 10 times more expensive than the TLD system, but that provides 3D information where the TLDs provide useful 2D information. And I just thought I'd put this slide in because as we move forward in Marsden towards MR guided radiotherapy using the combination of a MR scanner with a LINAC, which is a complicated technical challenge, the RT safe gel system is ideally situated because not only can you irradiate and plan the dose, you can read it out in the same system. I'm going to check the time and ask whether we have any questions at this stage, or whether I could carry on for a bit.
Thank you, Rollo. How much longer do you have? I'm just looking at the attendees, and mostly from physics and engineering background. I think there's a couple from elsewhere. So,
Fine.
how much longer do you think you would want to speak for?
I've probably got a couple more slides which I'd key in and then stop.
Yeah, go for that. A couple more slides, and then we'll open up for questions. Thanks, Rollo.
So I'm going to change the focus here from precise and particular assessments of dosimetry. I'm going to go to a more general quality control, systematic planning, and so on, using our highly trained operators, which I love, who I love, I should say. These notions of audit and accreditation, I'm sure you guys have come across MPACE and the BS 70,000, but it's basically how do we realistically implement some of these approaches. It's basically about training and competence and demonstration of those two things. And the Radiation Assessments Department of the MEG in the UK HSA have put together some videos of how the historic development of learning systems in radiation therapy have evolved. And indeed, that group have moved on towards this notion of safety too, which is basically concentrating one's effort into understanding how come as many things go right as they seem to do so. So it's not the absence of incidents, but the presence of capacity is the key idea, the capacity to actually make things go right. And I'll just make a brief mention of the RTTQA. That's the Trials Quality Assurance Group for Radiotherapy, who's been running under Edwin Ed and now Liz Miles and Patty Diaz for a long time. I was involved with RTO1 and Karen Venables with START, as Liz was with START, I should say. Okay, I'm going to move to the end if I can, because I wanted to go. No, this was a brilliant idea in Germany. Phantom X. You guys might be interested in AI. What this is another 3D printed phantom, but it's printed with radio opaque ink, and they've introduced different contrast objects into the print. So what you end up with is a 3D object. We've got one, but it's not a head, it's a spine. And you can image this in your scanners and expect to see contrast detail like that for now to assess. And it's useful in radiotherapy for AI contouring and indeed for radiology. Right, I'm going to move swiftly on about the national group of dosimetry audits that in radiotherapy we get involved with, auditing and visiting each other. And MPACE, I had been involved with the first centre at Hull, excuse me, and I would pause to say that the collaborative and cooperative team within medical physics itself is key to our good and safe continuation. So to conclude, I'd say it's crucial to take enough time to record accurate data, and it's even more important to avoid tedium, because doing long hours at the LINAC or the CT scanner is very difficult to maintain attention. And using the trends of how data have been behaving in the recent time and the distant time is important. That means the setting up of good baselines and the reviewing of the appropriateness of those, and talk to colleagues. Now, I should put listen to colleagues as well there. Please interpret talk as both talk and listen, i.e. discuss. And we always think about the quality control for a particular type of patient at least the day, if not the year, before the patient is on the couch.